Good evening and welcome to Artist Talk on Art, Monday, June 1st at 7 p.m. Eastern. I'm Alex Cohen, Programming Director of Artist Talk on Art. Artist Talk on Art is the world's longest running art panel forum in art history. Founded in 1974, ATOA has held and recorded over 1,200 events in audio and video featuring more than 9,000 artists and other art professionals. All ATOA events are recorded, copyrighted, and then posted to our YouTube channel, Artist Talk on Art 2026. Please hold your questions or comments until the last part of our 90-minute event and remain muted until that time. And now, I'd like to introduce our guests. Gail Levin is a distinguished professor of art history, fine and performing arts, American Studies, and women's studies at Baruch College and the Graduate Center of CUNY. Her frequent focus on women artists led to biographies of Judy Chicago, Lee Krasner, and the definitive biography of Edward Hopper, and now the brand new Alice Baber biography. Levin was presented with a rare ATOA Lifetime Achievement Award in May 2024. Levin, the acknowledged authority on the American painter Edward Hopper, is the author of Edward Hopper, A Catalogue Raisonné, 1995. Her work on 20th century contemporary art has won international acclaim, been widely published and translated in America, Europe, Asia, and Australia. Articles range from theories of artist biographies to exploration of American, Asian, and Jewish cultural studies. Douglas Shear, A2A co-founder in 1974 and chairman emeritus, painter and writer Douglas L. Shear was born in New York City to two artist parents, Benjamin Shear and Marcia C. Shear. He grew up in Greenwich Village. Both of his parents have been a part of the Artists Union and WPA in the 1930s and were Hans Hofmann students in the 1950s. Together, they spent 13 summers in Provincetown. He resides in Woodstock, New York, and now I'll hand it over to them.
Okay, Gail, please feel free to lead off with
Okay,
your presentation, and I'm going to hold most of my comments until you complete that.
but feel free to jump in.
Oh, I
Uh,
will. I will.
Doug, it's always a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome.
And lovely to see people I know and don't know in the audience. So I'm going to talk about Alice Baber, um, whom I knew very little about when I started this project, and whom I really came to appreciate and love. She's just was, I think, a very nice person. I didn't know her, but I knew about 50 people who did. And I was able to interview, not that I knew them all, but another 2 dozen or so who knew Alice. Well, Alice Baber produced some exquisite abstract paintings with this beautiful illusion of floating light. And this is the book cover, the new book. And you can see Alice Baber was quite an attractive person, which I think for a young woman can be an obstacle to be taken seriously. So Baber was very short-lived. Um, Down here. There you see some of the illusionistic light, and you see Baber in her studio. I'm just gonna hope I can put that away. And it's pretty remarkable that an artist who was in about 49 major museums at her death could be so obscured, but she died at only age 54. She had no children. She was divorced from a man she'd spent a decade with, a few of those years married to him. That's Paul Jenkins, whom we'll get to. But she is, and this book is not just about Alice Baber, but it's really about all the women artists of her generation. They really suffered a kind of bias. I should have turned off that sound, but we'll just live with it. Um, so when she died, Alice Baber's work was uh, in all these major museums. I'm just going to show you a few. The Turning Door from 1969, which is at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and which has some of the movement, which is related to the fact that Alice Baber was a synesthetic artist, which is a perceptual and neurological phenomena in which the stimulation of one sensory or cognitive pathway automatically triggers an experience in another pathway. So you can relate, for example, color with a number or a letter or a taste or a sound or movement, in this case, uh, can also be synesthetic. There are volumes written about that. And for example, Van Gogh is thought to have been synesthetic. But this also has this X motif in it, which we'll get to later. She loved that motif. This is the website of the Metropolitan Museum, which owns an 8-foot wide major painting by Alice Baber from 1979, so just 3 years before her death. And it's when she's painting with a very pale palette. And before I expressed interest in Alice Baber, the Met's website, and I'll show you that later, had just a tiny black and white reproduction like the size of a postage stamp. And even so, I wasn't really able to get the quality of photograph that I wanted because the painting, which is in offsite storage, has never even been exhibited. And it was acquired by the great Met curator, William Lieberman, Bill Lieberman, whom I knew well, and who came from MoMA, where he was an important curator there. But we'll get back to that. And the Guggenheim has this beautiful triptych, which is very pale and hard to reproduce. Part of the name is The Piper Sees the Ladder of the Jaguar. This is from 1978, just a year before the Met's painting. And I didn't reproduce it in the book because the book is obviously a vertical biography. And this is a very horizontal triptych, and it's very pale, so hard to reproduce. Whereas her earlier abstractions, easier to reproduce. But so we've got the MoMA, the Met, the Guggenheim, and the Whitney with a brighter painting. And this one was the gift of the man who took the photograph that you saw briefly on the cover of my book, a guy named Richard Galev, who was not a professional photographer, but took these wonderful photographs of Alice Baber. And it's an example of how Alice Baber actually covered up her romantic life. That is, she pretty much destroyed all the letters she had from any man she was involved with, including her husband. But her letters to her husband, Paul Jenkins, were preserved, and there were other clues. So I had a lot of fun doing the detective work. I like to say I was inspired by having read a lot of Nancy Drew novels growing up. But I like the challenge of, finding out the story when it's not known. So I really enjoyed this project. And there's a wonderful moment when I've given a lecture at a gallery, Barry Campbell in New York, um, on Alice Baber. They were having a show, and this woman, whom I knew as a young woman when she was an undergraduate at Harvard, I knew her mother, Mimi Poser, who interviewed me in her program, radio program, roundabout the Guggenheim. And Margaret came up to say hello, and she said, I had dinner with Alice Baber at my parents' house. And she remembered it vividly because she had been a student of the great scholar on Persian art, Oleg Grabar at Harvard. And Alice and Richard Galef, the man who took the photograph and gave this painting to the Whitney, were at dinner and projecting slides from their trip to Tehran, where I knew Alice had had a show in the 70s, about 74, 75, um, under the regime of the Shah. But I hadn't known that she'd been accompanied on the trip by the man she had a romance with, Richard Galef. So I was suspicious because he'd given this wonderful painting and he'd taken the wonderful photograph. But it was really nice to find by serendipity this confirmation. Now, here is an exact contemporary of Alice Baber, one you've no doubt heard of, Andy Warhol, and he only outlived Alice by 5 years. So they both had relatively short lives, but he got a lot more fame. And of course, he came to New York with a kind of network, a gay network. Plus, he was doing advertising art and store windows and shoe design. And well, Andy Warhol was a genius for getting publicity. Let's not take that away from him. But Alice was, as a woman, up against more obstacles, let's say. And another exact contemporary is Helen Frankenthaler. And the MoMA was early to acquire her painting, beautiful painting, Mountains in the Sea from 1952. I'd like to mention that although both of them are very interested in color and movement and abstract form, Helen liked to paint on unprimed canvases where her paint would be absorbed. And Alice primed her canvases, and she was much more controlled in her application of paint. That was by desire, by design. Well, one of the things I'm going to let you read about in the book is the lover that, not Clement Greenberg, another one, that Alice accidentally stole from Helen. And Helen used to have these wonderful soirees. She was very well to do, the daughter of a New York State Supreme Court judge. And she lived well and had these important parties in New York. And of course, once Alice ended up with her lover, she was banned forever from that whole salon and scene, which was not helpful. So I guess when you're a young woman in New York in the art world, you've got to be very careful who you get involved with. Well, right after Alice, and toward the end of her life and after her death, uh, the women's art world and feminist art takes a change for more feminist politics. Alice was a really serious feminist, but to see it in her art, it's very subtle. It's not in your face like Judy Chicago's Dinner Party or Miriam Shapiro's work, which I'll get into later. And then by the time of Alice's, so they're doing that, those two feminists from the late 60s, and certainly with the first feminist program in Fresno. But by the time of Alice's death, a younger generation, like Barbara Kruger, is doing much more political work, very different from the lyrical abstraction that Alice was doing at her death in 1982. And her obituary in the New York Times, hailed her as an artist of lyrical abstractions. And then briefly, I don't want to get censored on YouTube, Carolee Schneemann pulled out uh, that feminist text from her vagina in a performance which took place in East Hampton at Oshawa Hall in 1975. And that was in a show organized by Joan Simmel and Joyce Kozloff, both still very active feminist artists. But Alice was in that show, and that's my first knowledge about Alice. But I published about that show in the East Hampton Star. You can see it on my website, Gail Levin at CUNY Commons, that article on Carolee Schneemann and all the women in that show. But Alice was already dead by the time I wrote my article. I think it was in the early 1990s. So Alice remained a kind of mystery for me for a long time. Um, at any rate, she needed the Guerrilla Girls during her lifetime, but they didn't exist until 1985, 3 years until after her death. And of course, you all know that they promote equality, not only for women artists, but for other minorities. And Alice did too. She was early in the 1970s, and this is actually recorded on a radio program where she's speaking out for equality for women artists, also for artists of color, for Blacks, and for returning veterans, I suppose, from the World War II and the Korean War. So why are we hearing about Alice Baber suddenly? And I would say that she was well collected during her lifetime. She showed at A.M. Sachs Gallery, a lovely dealer who started out selling Chinese antiquities, and when the Cultural Revolution happened, switched to contemporary American art. And I knew him as a graduate student, and he was one of the nicest dealers. You never felt unwelcome at his gallery, even though you didn't have money to buy anything, and he knew it. He was just so gracious. But what's happened is those paintings and others that were acquired before 1982, those owners are dying off, and the families that inherit the paintings sometimes have to divide up the proceeds, so they put them up at auction. And people began to notice Alice Baber's, certain people, especially some savvy dealers in the art market, saw paintings of real beauty and I would guess marketability. And this is an example of one that came up at auction in, I think, 2023. It's called When Divided Mist the Darker. It's one of Alice's metaphorical poetic titles from 1972. And you can see it commanded almost $700,000. Well, that makes the art market wake up. And so people started looking more into who was Alice Baber. And I will just, well, I'll get to that another way that I knew her. But let me say she was born in Charleston, Illinois, really rural southeastern Illinois, and not up by Chicago at all. And there she is in the summer of 1929, not even a year old, with her older sister and only sibling, Nancy. Um, and Nancy got kind of neglected a little bit because her mother died when Alice was just 15, their mother, and their father really appreciated Alice's talent, which showed at a very young age. Let's say already by the age of 5, she was illustrating and writing little books of poetry and stories. And her father really encouraged her career. He's the kind of parent every artist dreams of having. Not at all the one that tells you you'll never make it, what are you going to be, a starving artist? He was the opposite. He really believed in her. And there you see her right after she first arrives in New York in around 1952. She came in the fall of 1951, having attended a women's college for a couple of years in the suburbs of St. Louis and a Presbyterian small college. And then she went on to Indiana University and she did a year of graduate work there before spending the summer doing graduate work in Fontainebleau, where Nadia Boulanger had welcomed Aaron Copland to the same school and other composers. It was very important music, but Alice was studying painting there. And here you see her and her vivacity in New York. And here you can see how beloved she was. This is her high school yearbook. She graduated in Kansas, Illinois, not Kansas, the state. It's a really small town. And they wrote in the yearbook, not all artistic people are bohemian. Alice proves it. And I just love that because she didn't put off anyone. And that's really the story of her entire career. She's very open, very welcoming, very adaptable. And on the ship coming back from Fontainebleau, she meets Colette Levy Roberts, who um, had grown up in France before the Second World War, was Jewish, came to New York. She ran a gallery for the National Association of Women Artists. Um, and then she was, back in Europe for the summer, and she was actually teaching sketching on board the ship that Alice returned on. And she invited Alice to go to an artist opening at a gallery in New York, the first one Alice ever went to. And that inspired Alice to look around for a job at galleries. But instead, she found a roommate who was living in this vertical artist colony on West 23rd Street in Manhattan called the Chelsea Hotel. Later, the story of where Sid Vicious and punk rockers were. But at the time, there was the poet Dylan Thomas, whose work Alice studied. Alice, as I said, was writing poetry even as a 5-year-old, but all through college. And she loved poetry. Dylan Thomas commented about the Chelsea Hotel um, that even the cockroaches there have teeth. So that really gives you an idea of what a quirky, crazy place it was. Alice only lasted 8 months there, and then she got her own apartment on Bedford Street. She managed to do that because she got a job. First, she worked for an industrial designer, but after a couple of years, she was working as an editor. You see her, whoops, I hope you can, that this is not blocking. There you see her next to the red as an editor on the masthead um, of McCall's magazine. Wikipedia gives a lot of misinformation about Alice, and they say she was an art editor, but really she wasn't. And it's not, it was a family magazine with articles like, Christmas decorations you can do with your children, but also things having nothing to do with crafts or art, but home design and things like that. And Alice prepared, and there's the designer she worked for, the industrial designer George Nelson. Alice was working like as a publicist for George Nelson and also conceptualizing features. And this one was for December 1954 in Life magazine. And we know about it because her father wrote to her Aunt Bonnie, her beloved Aunt Bonnie back in Illinois. Her father was by then living where they spent a lot of winters, and he had a kind of agricultural feed store in South Florida. And I should have turned that off. Well, um, he said to Aunt Bonnie, if you haven't thrown out Life magazine, save it, because the kitchen, and the kitchen is the one you see at the bottom here, was designed by Alice, though no employee would ever get credit. But I want to point out Alice's painting at the top from 9 years later called Where They Meet. It's an abstract painting. But look at the palette. You can already see that she's developed that palette, the yellow, blue, and orange, and even a little pink, for this kitchen. So there she is. And here's another one of her features, this one for McCall's. And she said, I work for a magazine. I tried not to let people know. I did because it was considered very unprofessional to have a job. But I figured you had to survive. You had to do something. And there weren't any teaching jobs. She meant for women, especially who didn't have MFA degrees, because she never finished hers. Um, she commissioned, she designed this feature also. So this is the kind of thing she did. It's kitchen advertising of kitchen design. And the little artworks in the background she commissioned from the daughter of the sculptor Ibram Lassaw and his wife Ernestine, who in New York became her dear friends. And their daughter Denise, at 12 years old, made these uh, children's art for this. And those are two little children models. But Alice sent her not only payment, but a tear sheet of her work published, and Denise shared it with me. And Alice, so she had a 9 to 5 job, so she had to paint at nights and weekends. And you see her painting, and she called it Ursula Sleeping. And she said, it was very metaphorical. You could see in it a landscape. So think of George O'Keeffe painting female anatomy in the landscape in New Mexico. This is Alice Baber painting landscape in female anatomy, posing for her in her studio at night in New York. And the poor friend is so exhausted from her job that she falls asleep. And Alice says, so you see, she says, everything for me is not one thing, but a dozen other things. So she's always seeing metaphor, and the titles of her pictures also reflect that. And right when Alice arrives in New York, she, of course, goes to MoMA. This is her first time in New York. And the painting on the lower left, is Alice's, but the Matisse show inspired it. The Matisse show by Alfred Barr with a big book, Matisse, The Art in His Public, was on in the fall of 51 when Alice arrived. And you can see how the checkerboard background relates to Henri Matisse's The Hindu Pose, seen on the right. And it's not surprising that Alice was drawn to that particular Matisse because Alice was fascinated by Asian religions, not just Hinduism, but also Buddhism. And she studied both of them, taking courses. But when she was at Lindenwood College, her small Presbyterian women's college, now a university, they wanted her to take religion. Of course, that would be Christianity, which she grew up in. And she didn't want to waste time on such a course. She said, oh, no, I can't take that. I'm a Buddhist. So later on, she gets very engaged by Buddhism. Well, Alice settled on Bedford Street in Greenwich Village in her own place, which she kept well into the 70s, even when she went off to Paris, which we'll get to. And here you see her painting of Bleecker Street, the sort of peddlers and the immigrant women, but the patterns and colors are predictive of her abstractions. And she was working for photographs, which we know because she sent them to her father, who already had the painting. And the palette is inspired, I think, by Arshile Gorky's work. Alice missed his memorial, which was at the Whitney just a little bit before, but she said when she got to New York, everybody was talking about our show, Gorky. The show had been done by another woman, abstract expressionist painter, Ethel Schwabacher, and we could compare Gorky's memory. He's an Armenian immigrant to New York who lost his mother in the Armenian genocide, but he had photographs of her. He painted two versions of this painting, this one in the National Gallery, but I think the wonderful warm pink palette, pink and orange palette inspired Alice. And she was looking at Gorky's abstractions. You see her moving toward abstraction. This one is in the Link Art Gallery, which is a museum where she spent a lot of her childhood, the town, not the museum, because it didn't exist in the same way. But it was Paris, Illinois, not Paris, France, where she also spent a lot of her adult life as an artist, but Paris, Illinois. And it's a very small place, but Alice gave a lot of her early work to this charming little museum, which has it today in Paris, Illinois, including this painting. And I see here the form of African art in this abstraction. I don't know if you agree or not. But Alice loved to go to museums in New York. She talked about going to the Met, and she loved Baroque art, which she had already discovered when her family was spending a lot of winters in South Florida, where I mentioned her father had a feed store. And Alice went to the museum in Sarasota, Florida, the Ringling, and discovered Baroque art there. But Rubens, this one at the Met, Alice admired Baroque space. She said, I do like the idea of space doing all kinds of crazy things, the unexpected. So that sense of movement was very important to Baber. And yet, when she's in New York, she still wants to study figurative painting. She tries, she drops by the Hoffman School, but like Lee Krasner, um, she was very much put off by the fact that she saw Hoffman working on student work. Sometimes he would even rip it up, but he would draw right on it. It offended Lee Krasner a decade earlier, more than a decade earlier. He was still doing it. So Alice takes herself over to the Art Students League, and she studied figure painting with Robert Beverly Hale, who is also the curator at the Met that acquired Jackson Pollock's Autumn Rhythm of 1950, soon after Pollock's death from the car crash in 1956.
Gail, I'm going to
Yeah.
suggest you use about another maybe 8 minutes,
Okay.
and then we'll move to my questions for you.
Okay.
Okay.
So Alice had this world famous paintings by Rockwell Kent, two copies when she was just 12 years old. She was a prodigy. Here you see her mature work, Green Swing, which she admired in that book, the Fragonard painting, The Swing, which is the original in London, and her Way Wing. So that sort of classic art goes into, but also modernism here by Paul Klee on the right that inspired her abstract painting. You can see the chartreuse circle. This is a painting always called cryptic. She asked the madman with whom she was briefly involved, the American surrealist sculptor and photographer David Hare, what do you think happens on the other side of these forms? He said, I don't know. But I think the fact that nobody knew really appealed to Alice and provoked her imagination. Just gonna skip on. And I want to get to the Cedar Bar. There's lots of new information about the Cedar Bar and the Artist Club. That's where Alice got invited to be in this co-op gallery, the March Gallery, by Felix de Picelis. And this is Alice invited Elaine de Kooning to join the gallery. She was one of the first group. And Elaine bought Alice's last painting before she died, and then she painted from memory this posthumous portrait of Alice. You can see she was very beautiful. And her work was discovered by Tom Hess, the editor of Art News, the critic who later became a curator at the Met. And this is Alice's still life from 1957. And you can see from the tiny black and white photograph how it was reproduced in Art News. You really needed to see its big 50 by 66 inches. You had to see it in color. But she's moving from still life to abstraction. And here you see how beautiful she was posing in 1957 before another one of her still lifes. And then you see her with the young Paul Jenkins, with whom she takes up. But before that, before Wolf Kahn met the woman he married, Alice Mason, the artist, um, he was dating Alice Baber. And I know that from Ilya Bolitovsky's son, Andrew, the musician, who remembers how generous and special and lovely Alice was because she always gave him 10 cents every time she saw him so he could buy his favorite chewing gum. And there you see film frames from the film called Wolfgang. Wolfgang Paints a Picture. And there is Alice and Paul Jenkins with Mike Kanemitsu, his classmate in the Art Students League class of Yasuo Kuniyoshi. And here you see Alice with her older sister, but Alice is with Japanese fan, the Japanese invented fans. And that's something Alice shared with the man in this drawing. That's Paul Jenkins from 1958, an intimate scene in his pajamas. And there they are, 2 weeks after Alice's triumphant solo show at the March Gallery on 10th Street, her co-op. And it's a wonderful time. She's launching her career in New York, and she's fallen in love with Paul Jenkins. So she follows him back to Paris to live with him. Well, it's hard to say if it was a mistake, but it didn't work out well, although they spent 10 years together. Um, it ended unhappily. And there's Paul Jenkins as I knew him. I interviewed him for the Lee Krasner biography. I found him charming. I didn't know that he was such an alcoholic I learned during research for this, not from Ellis, but from his daughter and um, his former mistress, that he never went out without his flask. I think he tied it to his calf. But anyway, I found him charming and lovely. Unfortunately, he was not faithful to Alice, and I would say broke her heart and held her back. But here you see at the Lassaus, Ernestine Lassaw, this is the sculpture with his wife and Alice Baber on the right, Philip Pavia, who founded the club, his first wife, Marcia, Alice Baber next to Alfred Leslie, the painter. Christmas at the Lassaws. And they really took to Alice, kind of introduced her to everyone in the art world. In 1964, Alice is living now for 6 years or so, and she and Paul finally marry, and they are in a two-person show with the Gutai in Japan, and then they take a trip through India and Asia, and you see them here posing like the Maharaja. And here you see them at the Gutai show, which is a two-person show. And this guy was not identified in the Japanese magazine. That's Paul Jenkins. But I immediately recognized him as my friend Bill Lieberman, the curator from MoMA at the time. And so he was doing research. Alice and Paul both shared this love of Asian art, especially Japanese, and they collected all kinds of Asian art and tantric art. And they're here featured in Art in America magazine, but shortly after this feature, Helen Frankenthaler and Robert Motherwell all these collecting couples featured. They were all non-coupled very soon after. Well, after they split, Alice's feminism really gets a lot of her attention. This is just to remind you of the feminist movement. And let's just look again at Alice's relationship, this wonderful painting, The Dance of the Wind Cave. And you could see the light is really inspired. And she talked about El Greco and Saint Jerome penitent in the cave. And the upper left corner is quite an inspiration, I think, for Alice's Dance of the Wind Cave. Here you see another wonderful cave painting that's an abstraction, Hermit in the Cave of Life, Light from 1976. And I want to end here with the very important X motif with the circle in the center that became a favorite motif. And we can relate it to what Miriam Shapiro and Judy Chicago referred to as the cut image. Um, and Hannah Wilke also depicted that. But Alice was much more subtle about this. If you didn't know it was a feminist motif, um, you probably wouldn't have any idea. But a male art critic um, took a look at it, loved the painting, um, and this one here, Lavender High, and it was Peter Sheldall. And he was very suspicious, though. He wrote in his article, "Oh, I wonder if it's a feminist motif." Oh, no, I'm giving a paraphrase. And of course, Alice was asked why she painted this X motif, the circle in the center, so often. And she suspected hostility, and she said, she responded, "Because I do like it." And then I think we have time just to look at her beautiful triptych from 1972, The Expulsion of the Mythical Kings, which she said was inspired by Christ in Majesty from the Eisenheim altarpiece from the 1515 in Colmar, France. And it was known to be given to sufferers of skin disease caused by eating rye of grass, of fungus. And so we have St. Anthony as part of the altarpiece with skin covered in sores. And this is the moment when poor Alice was diagnosed with melanoma, skin cancer, which would eventually take her life and spread to bone cancer. Here's another one of her wonderful triptychs. And this is the painting at the Met again. And I want to.
Let's move on if we can. And,
Bill Lieberman, I'm just going to
okay.
go right to the end here. I'll skip. Um, and I think the name comes from Princess Piki, the first woman ruler of the Maori people, collected by Nelson Rockefeller, given to the Met around this time. And Nancy Hanks, the first woman director of the NEA, was the cousin of Alice Baber and a very close friend. And I want to just say that, like King Tut's tomb, we have a lot to excavate with Alice Baber. And here she is, very brave, photographed by Sag Harbor photographer Anne Schwatzky, shortly before her death, wearing her harness from the bone cancer, still painting watercolors. Brave Alice Baber. And there you see one of the late watercolors. Okay, Doug, take it.
If you would close the screen share, then
Okay.
you and I will end up, I think, side by side or something like that. Okay. Um, so one of the quirky things I think that Alice decided to do was to not study with Hans Hofmann, especially given the moment in which she made that decision, because so many of her contemporaries were in fact doing that. They were studying with Hofmann, primarily on A Street, but others that also went to Provincetown or did both. And I thought how quirky that was, until I considered that she really wasn't a true abstract expressionist. She was more of a systemic abstractionist.
She's really in that space between abstract expressionism and post-painterly abstraction.
Right, exactly. So I thought, well, she was influenced by the Orphism concept of Robert and Sonia Delaunay.
Absolutely.
And
Oh,
I
she,
think that
oh,
she, you see in the soft focus treatment of so much of the canvases, or most of the canvases, um, and yet a certain rigidity of the layouts of the compositions, which goes to the systemic approach. And
she
it's
was
just
much,
amplified by the X designs as well.
yeah, she was much more controlled than the typical abstract expressionist. She
Exactly.
would stain and really control where the paint went.
Even using her fingers to
Absolutely.
yeah, to press things in. Um, Another thing I found interesting, because the club was a very early influence to the establishing of Artist Talk on Art. We all had in common that we were impressed by what the club had done, albeit that it was a sort of drunken brawl, but and also that they never. It isn't that they never recorded anything, but they didn't really take that seriously. And so there's only one known recording that survived, which is called The Debate between Ed Reinhardt and Milton Resnick. But it's a rare surviving, you know, documentation of the club. But
Doug, you know,
I was going to say that the club ran from around 1949 to initially to about 1960, first by, Philip Pavia and a few of his colleagues, and then for about 5 years by Irving Sandler, bring it to basically the end of the 50s. And then Pavia came back. And what's interesting about Pavia related to Alice Baber is that it was at that point that he invited a number of women, not too many, but at least a cluster of women artists, to be members of the revival of the club. Whereas during the heyday, if you want to argue the heyday of the club, 49 to roughly 60, women were very rarely members. They would come as guests of a male member of the club. So I'm curious to know what kind of impact that had on Alice and uh, her other female artist friends in
well, you
that
know,
last part of the club.
Alice loved the club, and she was pretty much introduced to it by Ibram and Ernestine Lassaw to the
Uh-huh.
first part of the club when
Right.
Pavia was running it. One of my favorite findings, though, Alice talked about um, how difficult it was for women at the club and how the men were hostile when women wanted to wear jeans, blue jeans.
Right.
And I wrote to Irving Sandler's widow, the art historian, Lucy
Right.
Freeman Sandler,
Right.
and she said, I don't remember anything except that Alice Baber was beautiful and she
Hmm.
wore red high heels to the club. And
Okay.
I thought that was priceless because it was clear that Alice wasn't one of the women that wore jeans, but she
Right.
empathized with them. She
Right.
also organized a panel about Japanese performance art.
Hmm.
And she was in touch with people from Japan Society. She was really energetic and devoted to the substance of the panels at the club.
So that was in the one she organized was in that post 1960 period. Hmm. Um, she was quite deliberate, I think, technically in her painting style and process, and such as that we already discussed. But Jenkins was so much looser than she was in his style. So I'm curious to know from the time they spent together, which is around a decade, even before, even before the marriage. Um, what do you think that Paul Jenkins got from her artistically, and what do you think she got from him? She must have gotten some things from him as well.
Yeah. It's kind of hard to separate it out, but they
Mhm.
definitely gave to each other. She was writing a book about him when they split up.
Uh-huh.
So I think she was catering to his much bigger male ego. I don't think he ever would have written about her. They both wrote. He actually wrote a play in which she's referred to indirectly. It was
Uh-huh.
published and performed. Um, in fact, he studied drama before he became a painter.
Mhm.
But they were painting watercolors next to each other on the beach in Spain.
Uh-huh.
So they're there painting in the same outdoor studio.
Right.
You you can't get
But
closer than
indoors,
that.
they had separate studios indoors,
Oh
correct?
yes,
Yeah.
yes. And in New York they held studios,
Mhm.
and in Paris, not in the same space at all.
Where in Paris were they living and working?
Um, Near Montparnasse.
Uh-huh.
He had a home. I actually visited him there. And that's because I was interviewing him about Lee Krasner for that biography.
Uh-huh.
That's,
Okay.
yeah.
Um, you've spoken and written at length about the efforts that were made by Jenkins' widow, the third wife, Suzanne Donnelly Jenkins, to obscure Baber from view, to act to prevent exhibitions, and just generally suppress her reputation. That's, I think, what you're meaning even more than the cancer when you talk about the tragic circumstances of her life as an artist. Can you
Certainly,
elaborate on that a little?
yeah. And I knew Suzanne Donnelly Jenkins. I liked her.
Uh-huh.
She
Uh-huh.
commissioned me to write two catalog essays about Paul
Uh-huh.
Jenkins.
Okay.
And that certainly, one was about the influence of Japanese culture on Jenkins,
Mhm.
published in London. But she never mentioned Alice Baber to me, neither did Paul Jenkins, although I knew Alice Baber's name from the show at Oshawa Hall with Carolee Schneemann, and
Mhm.
I knew Alice Baber's name from the Memorial Library that used to have her books at Guildhall in East Hampton, which has
Mhm.
now been obliterated, and the books
Right.
and their list have been lost. But even in the two main obituaries in the New York Times and the Guardian,
Mhm.
the first wife, with whom Paul Jenkins edited a book about the critic Michel Tapier, and Alice Baber, his second wife, they're not even mentioned in
Mhm.
Jenkins' obituary. But his daughter with the first wife, Hilary Jenkins, is mentioned as if
Uh-huh.
she's the last wife's daughter, which she wasn't.
Right.
So it's very bizarre effort to kind and then the estate of Paul Jenkins, run by the widow, sold dozens of Alice Baber's paintings to Barry Campbell Gallery in New York with the
Uh-huh.
restriction that they couldn't give her a show, which they ethically
Uh-huh.
honored during the widow's lifetime. And as
Uh-huh.
soon as she was out of the picture and dead, they gave Alice Baber a show.
Following on to this same theme a little bit, in my own searches preparing to talk to you tonight, um, I looked in a number of the books that I have, and I'm sure you have. Fred McDarra's Artist World, which was published in 1959. It certainly has lots of her contemporaries, but she's not mentioned in that book at
Yeah,
all or pictured in it. Ninth Street Women, Mary Gabriel's more recent book about the same scene, again, doesn't mention Alice Baber. And Edith Schloss's Loft Generation doesn't mention her either. Not that these are the end all be all of that period writing, the writing of the period. But then she is mentioned in Pavia's Club Without Walls, both in, I believe in, I got to
but
correct
incorrectly. Um,
incorrectly.
yes, they're crediting her, knowing her at the club through Paul Jenkins.
I see.
She
Okay.
was at the club well before she knew Paul Jenkins.
Right. So that leads me to ask the question, since she arrived in New York in 1951, um, and the well, the relationship, they married in 64. They first met in the mid 50s, according to the book, according to your book. Um, when
58,
were the, sorry?
58, 58, not
Oh,
mid.
well, that makes more sense to me now, even more sense. Um, Given that, when were the various museum purchases or donations made of Alice's work? When did that begin, do you think?
Oh, certainly not till she comes back and
From
forth.
Paris?
Nothing, certainly, but probably not till the 70s, but
Okay.
certainly nothing before the 60s.
Hmm.
But
And,
she's having these shows at Abe Sachs Gallery, which is
uh,
mostly on 57th Street. So
right,
that got her to be known.
right. Um, Another thought is that, Baber was actually younger than many of the other women artists who became her contemporaries. So, for example, Grace Hardigan was born in 1922 and Elaine de Kooning in 1918. So I think that this it must have had, and yet, she's considered, that is, Alice is considered a post-World War II, part of that post-World War II generation. Um, but this must have affected her acceptance to some degree, despite the fact that she was somewhat behind some of the leading lights of abstract expressionism. Although interestingly, you can't really call Elaine de Kooning an abstract expressionist, but a New York school painter. So, would that also be how you would characterize, if you had to pin something on Alice Baber other than abstract expressionist, would you consider her in the same manner as, let's say, we consider Robert De Niro Sr. or Larry Rivers, let's say, as being New York school painters, but not abstract expressionists,
Well, she's really a kind of lyrical abstractionist.
right?
I mean, maybe you could link her, but but you can kind of link her with Helen Frankenthaler, who was her exact
Yes,
contemporary. The
yes.
difference is that Helen Frankenthaler had Clement Greenberg promoting her for 5 years.
Doesn't hurt.
Yeah, the critic. Everybody
Mhm.
knows who that is.
One of the recurring themes in the book is what you call the tragic circumstances in her life. And it's a little mysterious in her childhood, and you and I have spoken about this, separately, that we know that there was something difficult going on health-wise with her early life, but the book never really reveals, and I think you said you could never really find clarity about what that illness was.
Oh no, I think that's really a cover for her father's mental breakdown.
Uh,
And he was a bank president in
right,
Paris, Illinois,
right,
at the moment that the stock market crashed in 29.
right,
And so he had to foreclose on the whole community, all these farmers.
right.
And
That's horrible.
he couldn't take it. And he
Yeah.
had a mental breakdown. And
Right.
it's the moment when insane asylums became mental hospitals, literally. And he
Hmm.
goes off to a hospital run by nuns, I think, in
Hmm.
Florida. And he moves from being a banker to
Hmm.
opening an agricultural feed store for animals like
Hmm.
his father had done. And um, Aidan Baber, her father, must have been the sweetest man, very intellectual, very well read. He'd been an ambulance driver in World War II. He was so supportive,
Hmm.
and he published on Native Americans, on lots of nature, horticultural, on the DeSoto expedition, the Spanish explorer in Florida,
Hmm.
and which fruits and native fruits and vegetables they were eating. And so Alice even has titles that refer to some of that stuff.
Right.
It was a very unusual childhood, I would
Right.
say.
So in many ways, it really was very privileged. I mean, she came from privilege in childhood. I know that she was related to Abraham Lincoln and also separately to his wife's family. Is that right? I
Yeah,
think so.
to Abraham Lincoln's mother's family.
Mother's
Her,
family.
her
Yeah.
father was a direct descendant, and he wrote all these sort
Hmm.
of books about the Hanks family. It's Nancy Hanks.
Hanks, right.
But her other descendant is the cousin I showed you that
Right.
was,
The NEA
yeah,
connection. Yeah.
connection and the
Right.
Rockefeller connection.
I think we should give over some time now to the audience to let
Okay.
people either make comments or ask questions. And if you want to do that, just unmute yourself and go ahead.
I'd like to make a comment. I'm Barbara Ray Schaefer, and I had the honor and the good fortune to actually study with Alice Faber for a
Whoa.
semester when I was an undergraduate BFA student at the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis.
Oh,
Uh,
wow. That's in the
well,
book.
Oh, well, I'm going to read your book, of course.
Yeah.
So she was my the fall semester of my senior year, and I was going to graduate in the spring. And she had a profound influence on me and my work. I believe she was the first woman to teach a painting class at the University of Minnesota.
uh-huh.
And she just said, "Oh, you've got to get out of here. You've got to get to New
Uh-huh.
York."
That's what her teacher told her in
And that's what I
in,
did.
St. Louis, actually.
And she was a brilliant teacher. She was just very, very gifted and beautiful and very always impeccably dressed. I never saw her in blue jeans. And
Did you save anything from the class? Any papers or anything?
I'll have to look.
Any,
I'll dig and see.
my email is online if you Google me at CUNY, and I'd love
Okay.
to be in touch with you.
Oh, that'd be great.
There was
Thank
no way
you.
to find people like you when I was doing my research. Thank you.
Someone else? Don't be bashful.
Okay, I'll
Maybe
ask a question.
go right ahead, Jody.
Hi, Gail.
Hi,
Um,
Jody.
hi.
This is, I'll say, um, uh, the art dealer who fell in love with Alice Baber, collected her work, and did recently a very big show, and also was the first to ask me, would I consider writing a catalog essay on Alice Baber,
Right.
which led me to want to write the biography.
This is Jody Klotz without her cowgirl hat.
From Abilene, Texas.
Well, transplanted New Yorker a long time ago, so but
Uh-huh.
I'm so glad that I had a lot to do with it, Gail. Thank you for acknowledging that. I really appreciate it. And given that, um, um, I've had a lot of opportunity to learn about a lot about Alice Baber through Gail and on my own, but mostly through Gail's research. And I think some of the questions that Doug asked, it, when you're speaking about in such a general way about trying to communicate so much information in a quick snippet, that some of the questions he asked, I think you could flush out a little bit more. And one in particular struck me was when Doug asked, and your questions were so insightful, when Doug asked about the tragedy of Alice Baber's life, which of course is alluded to in the title of the book. And you started to talk about Alice's, being supposedly ill when she was younger. Um, I think it's a great opportunity to talk about some of the other things about Alice's life that you've written about, like her mother dying when she was very young, and
15.
James Joyce writing about,
James Jones.
sorry, James
James
Jones, right?
Jones, yes.
James Jones, who was one of the people who wrote essays about her, which she carried through her life in terms of using it for many, many catalogs, where he first identified this idea of her painting, which can seem so just beautiful, superficially kind of beautiful to look at. And he said some things about what she was really trying to communicate, which I know you could flush out much more in that question. So that I would encourage you to talk more about that.
So
Let's not flush it out. Let's flesh it out.
James Jones talked about the tragedy of light in Alice Baber. He published that article, I think it was Art International, and she just loved it. They were very close friends. They met in Paris, but he died in Sagaponack on Eastern Long Island, and she was out there too in nearby Sag Harbor. And Kaylee Jones, James Jones' daughter, whom Alice knew as a child in Paris, saw her, at her death and kept up. Gloria Jones, her mother, kept up with Alice. Everybody loved Alice. But losing her mother was the one who really encouraged Alice to be an artist, a visual artist. Her father initially was more interested in Alice writing. She was talented with both. And I think she almost lost her father when he had this mental breakdown. Um, and then they moved, spent a lot of time in Florida, but losing her mother at age 15 was really losing the backbone, the person who really encouraged her. So I think that is part of the, and then of course, the relationship with Paul Jenkins ended kind of tragically also.
But I
So
think I think also another thing to mention, and I'm sure you can speak more eloquently than I about this, is I think he was referring to the emotional content of these very beautiful, light-filled, color-filled paintings, which he said something along the lines, and please correct me, Gail. He said something along the lines of, she was not just she was communicating a sadness, a great sadness,
yeah.
and in these light-filled paintings that she was, they weren't glib and they weren't trite. And you talked about Lee Krasner's painting that she painted right after Jackson Pollock died, which was of great vivid colors. And I'm trying to get you to talk about the emotional content
Yes.
of the paintings in
And
relation to what James Jones was saying.
actually, when we look at Alice Baber's titles, and they are very metaphorical, and they're filled with hints of meaning, some of which are confirmed by her poetry. But for example, she has all these references to the piper, and the piper mm, might not, she's might not occur to everybody what that is, but she's been thinking about also because she's thin aesthetic and she sees color and music, color and sound together. She's thinking about the very sad story that George Sand writes about the bagpiper, which is too complicated to go in here, but I have a whole chapter on it, and it's very poignant. And so Alice Baber is the paintings are beautiful just to look at them, but they're very deep in their um, significance. They're she gives you a sort of code, and it's up to us to kind of project or decipher the emotions behind the paintings.
So would it be fair to say that the title that you selected is sort of twofold? One about the actual tragedies that she experienced in her life, where, her father had a mental breakdown, her mother died when she was 15 years old. She had a broken marriage because her husband was unfaithful to her, and that being the tragedies in her life, but also on the other side, that the emotional content of the paintings James Jones refers to is her translation of that tragedy actually physically in the paintings. I think it's really important to point out that
And
that's
Alice is really a very positive spirit. She takes all this tragedy and she makes something beautiful out of it. And she also was very communicative, it's worth saying. She traveled all around the world with her art, having shows in India and Tehran, in New Delhi, all over Latin America, for the United States State Department, all over the Caribbean. And they loved her. And she's also promoting women artists, feminism, but she's relating to women and cultures and fate. So the paintings are very deep if you want to go there. That's what I would say. Thank you, Jody.
Someone else?
Hi, I'm Babs Reingold. Oh,
Hi.
did I cut somebody off?
We'll go to you, John, next.
Uh, okay. Um, a couple of thoughts. One, I'm always surprised when people look at works and they're not thinking about the deep content, and the artist is working out all of the content that's going on within themselves. They work because the work saves them. At least that's how I feel. Like if I can't go into the studio and put all the thoughts and feelings into these things, you would go mad, go crazy. But that's what I think happens when artists are making these pieces. They're not, I don't think they're trying to communicate to another person that they're deep and personal. This is what comes out when they're making it. And I wonder if you think of those things rather than
I think that's so well said and very apt for Alice Baber. I think that her art did save her. And that's why when you see that last photograph, she's practically dead and she's got to wear a brace and she's still painting watercolors.
yeah, exactly. That's it's like I know it saved me. I know what saves you. It's like you get this piece, this thing where because you're taking everything that's in there and now it's out of you. It's going into the work.
I don't know if you noticed that I had she did a show, she curated also and wrote. And she curated a show called Color Forum, a group show. She was
Yeah.
in it, but Mark Rothko was in it. And Rothko, of course, was a very great color painter who switched to black and gray before he committed suicide. And Alice Baber goes pale in her oil paintings, but in her watercolors and inks, she's still very bright colored and embracing life. And
Yeah.
she didn't give up. I mean, she lost the ability to go on living, but she was painting right almost till the very end.
Yeah. And some people are just inherently, they're more positive. Even with all the tragedy, they can be more positive, regardless of all of these horrible things that happen to you during your life. You somehow, and that positivity also is reflected in the art and then it's put out in the art, if that makes any sense too.
Absolutely. And Alice is a very positive figure. Yeah, she never loses that quest for the light, you know?
Well, you kept saying everybody wanted to be around her. This
Yeah.
is like people gravitated towards her, and that's a lovely thing. And if you emit those things, it comes back at you that way.
Hmm.
Anyway,
Thank you,
it,
Babs. Let's go to
that was
John. I know
it was a
John
wonderful presentation. That was the only
Thank
other thing I
you.
wanted to
John
say.
wanted to share
Thank you so
something.
much.
John, go ahead.
Yes, am I on now?
Yes.
Okay. Well, thanks for the introduction to Alice Baber's work. I know I've seen her pieces, like in MoMA here and there, but she never jumped out at me, and I've never had like the experience of having a one-person exhibition or whatever. So this is a good introduction. But what occurred to me is that she traveled at a time or worked at a time that was transitional because you brought up Andy Warhol, maybe the pop artists, where there was a shift and Peggy Guggenheim acknowledged this. She said abstract expressionism was the end. You know, she couldn't take pop art. Wasn't transitioning in that way. And I thought it brought to mind Alice's work with Cy Twombly, where you have an artist who doesn't go with the flow of pop art. There's a certain kind of sincerity, and they both are sort of visual poets. The poetry of her titles and Twombly using his poetry in his works, that there's a certain sincerity. There's not that element of pop, little bit of cynicism, like about capitalism and, you know, what the harshest part of life. There's, you know, she's sincere about her art more than wanting it to be popular, big name, all that kind of stuff. So that's what came to mind.
Yeah, I think that's an apt comparison. And she's very sincere. She's not a humorous. She's a deep thinker, and that's in the paintings.
Yes, good that you brought that out, and thank you.
Thank you.
Alex, your moment to take us home.
All right. Thank you everyone for a great conversation. Please join us Monday, June 8th at 7 p.m. Eastern for a dialogue between artist Joel Simpson and art critic A.D. Coleman. And thank you again, Gail and Doug, and also thank you to our board members and volunteers. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gail.
Thank you, Doug, and thank you to everyone.
And thank you, Jody.
Thank you. That was great. Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Al.
Wonderful talk.